Dr. Bruce Ashford has been teaching at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary since 2003. He presently serves as Provost and Professor of Theology and Culture. He has authored or co-authored 6 books. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Bruce Ashford.
Raleigh-Durham is home to about a dozen colleges and universities and about, around maybe 200,000 college students. We have about 2,000 of those college students at our church, and some of my favorite stories come from those students. So I wanted to open this evening by telling you about one of our sophomores at NC State who had been preparing all semester to try to pass his ornithology class, especially the final exam. It's the study of birds. And so, in his words, he gave it the ultimate effort studying for the final exam, which probably involved staying up all night the night before to cram and put an intravenous drip of Starbucks in his vein or something. But he stayed up all night, and when he went to the classroom the next day, he was dismayed to see an actual copy of the exam, because instead of the true, false, and multiple choice and essay questions that he had expected, there were just 25 photographs of birds. But it wasn't birds with all their beautiful feathers and their unique beaks. It was just 25 photos of birds' legs. And he began to get angry because this had only been a small portion of the class, and now it was the entire exam. He knew he couldn't pass it. There was no way he could pass this exam. And he said it wasn't his best day, and he wasn't a very good Summit Church member, but he said he stood up and threw down his exam and said, "This is insane. This is absolutely unfair." And he started to head for the door. But his professor said, "Well, listen, son, if you make a 0 on the final, you're going to fail the class. At least, take the test." And the students said, "Well, fine, I'll fail it." And the professor said, "Well, fine, I'll fail you. So who are you? Tell me your name." And to which our student responded by turning around, pulling up his pants legs and saying, "Well, I don't know. You tell me, professor. You tell me." So, I kind of like that story because that a kid would have the wherewithal to say that. But I think many of us who are Christians sometimes feel like this student, because if the Christian life, it could be compared to an exam in which we're tested on our faithfulness in a given historical context, the 21st century seems like an insanely challenging context. It wasn't what we asked for, it wasn't what we signed up for, was it? But it's what we've been handed. And so why is our cultural context such a challenge? I want to draw upon, very briefly, 2 or 3 minutes, 2 intellectuals, public intellectuals that you've probably never read, that will help explain why our context is so challenging. The first is a Jewish sociologist named Philip Rieff, who had been a rock star public intellectual in the 70s. He was on all the TV shows and all the literary magazines. He dropped off the map for 3 decades. And then in 2006, 7, and 8, as he was passing off the scene, he published a trilogy entitled The Sacred Order, Social Order Trilogy. And in that trilogy, he argues that the West in general, and the United States in particular, is in the midst of a historically unprecedented attempt to sever social order from sacred order. And what he means by that is to sever a religious ordering of the world from society, to keep religion from influencing people. What he said is this: civilizations everywhere in history, at all times and all places, have understood that sacred order shapes cultural institutions. In other words, religion shapes legal institutions. A religious ordering, a moral ordering of things, shapes legal institutions, educational institutions, families, churches, you name it, across the board. And that those institutions then shape people, the people in the society. But, Rieff said, a certain number of elite power players, and he calls them the officer class, in the United States have determined that they will rip sacred order out from underneath social order, leaving social order to float on its own. And he said in a situation like this, and he says this as a sociologist, in a situation like this, cultural institutions and cultural products become death works. He calls them death works. That instead of bringing life and vitality to society, they bring death and decay. And he said this project that elite power brokers embarked upon in the 1960s, it has not been going well for us, and it's only going to get worse. But he leaves with a note of hope. And he says, you may not be able to tell, he said, but there are already cracks in the foundation of this ordering of things, of people who are trying to do this. So that's Philip Rieff, and I thought that was a very way of conceptualizing why some of our cultural institutions, cultural influencers, and cultural products are causing us such harm today. The second intellectual was a Canadian philosopher named Charles Taylor. Now, he's not the guy with the tennis shoes, all right? Different guy. But Charles Taylor has published a mammoth book called A Secular Age. I don't recommend that you read it, at least not in bed at night, for fear that you might doze off and be crushed to death mid-sentence. It's about a 1,200-page book, but I've read it for you, and here's what he says. He says that we live, that Westerners in general, and even Americans, have learned to live life within the immanent frame. Now, it's fancy language for saying this. We've learned to manage life without reference to God, all of life without reference to God. And he said the result is this, is that Christianity is now viewed as implausible and even unimaginable. I mean, how could you possibly believe? I mean, what kind of a person are you? How ignorant, how backwards, how evil could you be to believe what you believe about gender, about sexuality, about salvation in Christ? I mean, you name it. And for the first time in history in America, you're actually often viewed as a morally bad person for believing the teachings of Christian Scripture. And he says not just that Christianity's been displaced from the default position, it's that it's now positively contested by dozens of other ideologies and ways of thinking and religions, so that almost everybody in society feels they have doubts about what they say they believe. So this is kind of the setting that many of the people around us, our neighbors, people on our Facebook wall, help me Lord, my Facebook wall. Yeah, many of the people that we know consider historic Christian teaching on any number of things implausible and even unimaginable, maybe even reprehensible. And in a situation like this, I think we're tempted to lose heart. But I want to argue this evening that we don't need to lose heart on the one hand and sort of withdraw and sort of slouch into a withdrawal. And also, we don't have to engage in panic politics or sort of angry public tantrums on the other hand. That what we can do is what Jesus asked us to do, is embrace his teaching that we should be salt and light in a world of corruption and darkness. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16, he says this, and let me read it to you. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. And then in verse 14, you are the light of the world. Now, he uses two metaphors here, salt and light. Let's take the salt metaphor for a moment. What does salt do for meat? Well, for millennia, before people had refrigerators and freezers, they would dig a cellar underground, and they would salt that meat down and put it as far down as they could where it would be cool. And the salt did two things for the meat. It made it savory, made it taste better. And number two, it kept it from spoiling. It preserved it. It was a preservative. But in order for salt to do either of those things to meat, it has to be chemically different than the meat. And what he was saying is this. As Christians, you have something to offer to the world. You can make it more savory than it would be otherwise, and you can preserve it from degrading and deteriorating. But the only way we can do that is if we are chemically different. And so it's okay to be different. It's okay to have the world's forces arrayed against us. In many ways, Christianity is at its strongest when we've been pushed to the margins a little bit. Historically, we've been salt and light in this society, and we still can be now and in the future, but only if we don't conform our Christianity to the demands of society around us. So I wrote this book, and Letters to an American Christian. It's a series of 27 brief letters to a hypothetical college student at DuPont University, and I'm encouraging him to avoid the beliefs of his secular progressive professors and some of his secular conservative relatives. And it really just addresses any number of policy issues in the States, here in the States, and I try to address it from a Christian perspective. What I want to do this evening is I want to, in the time that I've got left, I want to talk about Christian politics in a secular age. I'm going to divide the talk into 3 6 or 8 minute segments. So in the first 6 or 8 minute segment, we're going to talk about what is the appropriate relationship between Christianity on the one hand, politics and public life on the other hand. How do those things fit? All right? So that's a 30,000 foot level conversation. What should be the relationship between religion and politics, church and state? Those two questions aren't the same thing, actually. And what do we have to bring to the public square? The second segment, we're going to come down to the nitty-gritty, and I'm going to show you how one doctrine, one Christian teaching, I'm not going to tell you what it is. I'm going to keep the suspense there. How one Christian teaching, just one alone out of the many examples we could choose, can help us transcend some of the bipartisan bickering maybe, and maybe help shed some real light in a dark situation, okay? And we'll talk about how it applies to 3 different policy debates. And then finally, the last thing that I'm going to do is we're going to talk about politics in a secular age. So how do Christians relate differently to a secular age than we do a different sort of an age, a different era, say the 1920s or something like that? What should be the difference in how we engage? So let's get started. The first thing we're going to ask is, how should we conceive of the relationship between Christianity, politics, and public life? Now, I want to draw upon a man named Abraham Kuyper, all right? Now, I named my only son after him, so I'm all in. He was a Dutch pastor, a Bible-believing Dutch pastor who ended up founding a university, a newspaper, a political party. He was a member of parliament, and then he was the prime minister of the Netherlands. He was an amazing human being. Kuyper said something like this: if you look at patterns in the Bible and patterns in history, and you put them together as a sort of a lens, a dual lens through which you see the world, you can see that God created different kinds of culture, right? He created, just like he created different kinds of animal, he created the world so that we would have art and science, politics and economics, scholarship and education, sports and competition, business and entrepreneurship, marriage and family, church, all of these different kinds of culture. And he used a spatial analogy, and he said each of these kinds of culture is like a sphere, not a spear that you would chuck, but a sphere, all right? And on this analogy, each kind of culture, each sphere, has its own center and its own circumference. Its own center, meaning its own reason for being. Each kind of culture exists uniquely for its own reason. But for that same reason, it has its own circumference, or limits to its jurisdiction. So art exists to explore beauty. Science exists to advance our knowledge of the natural world. Government exists to achieve justice for the various individuals and communities under its purview. The church exists to disciple God's people so that they can go out into the world and honor Him. So each one has its own reason for being, but each one needs to swim in its own lane, not to get too big for its britches. The state doesn't need to reach. Kuyper compared the government to a giant octopus that grows on its own and swells until its tentacles reach into every square inch of our lives. And what he was doing with this sphere analogy is saying that each sphere does very well when it minds its own business and does what it's supposed to do. And when it tries to do what it's not supposed to do, it causes problems. All right? So this brings up a couple of questions. What is the relationship between religion and politics? What is the relationship between church and state? Often these are treated as if they're the same question, but they're not. So let's start with the religion and politics. First, we have to define religion, all right? Because if we don't get the definition right, we're going to head in the wrong direction. Now, most people would say, if you ask them what religion is, they'd say it's the worship of a supernatural deity. And if that's the case, then he can be very domesticated. You know, if it's just merely the worship of a supernatural deity in the private recesses of your home, that you're whispering about him in church, you can keep him out of the public square. But the Bible defines religion differently. The Bible says that all people are worshipers. Atheists are worshipers, agnostic are worshipers, everyone is a worshiper. That if you want to find a person's religion, look for their God. If you want to find their God, look for whatever they've ascribed ultimacy to, whatever they've absolutized. It might be the God of Jesus Christ, the Allah of Muhammad, it might be sexual freedom, it might be wealth acquisition, it might be power accumulation, success, the approval of other people, material equality, you name it. Whatever we've ascribed ultimacy to, whatever we've absolutized, there's our God. And the Bible teaches that it locates religion in relation to the heart over 800 times. And in the Bible, the heart is a central organizer of human existence. So whatever we have ascribed ultimacy to is going to be, and if it's located in the heart, it's going to organize our whole existence. So a person's religion, who they worship, what they worship, is absolutely going to cascade out into their life. It's going to radiate out into all of life, including political belief, political actions, dispositions, and demeanors. So religion cannot be separated from politics, just like it can't be separated from anything. And it shouldn't, and we shouldn't try to. Religion is not like a coat that you can take off and put on your chair when you walk into the public square, right? Religion is more like your skin. You can't take it off, or more like your heart. You can't take it out. The second question is, what is the proper relationship between church and state? Now, that's a little different. I think that we can and should maintain an appropriate separation between church and state. We want to avoid statism on the one hand and ecclesiasticism on the other. Those are technical words. Statism is when the state swells to gigantic proportions. It swims outside of its lane. It sticks its fingers where it has no business sticking its fingers, and we want to avoid that. We also want to avoid forms of ecclesiasticism, where the Southern Baptist Convention, I'm a Southern Baptist, or the Roman Catholic Church, or the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, or whoever, sets itself up in a coercive relationship with the government. The church as an institution has no business doing that. Christians have every business getting involved in politics and public life, but the church itself is not a public policy think tank. So we want to keep an appropriate separation there. Finally, given these realities, how can we as individuals engage in politics and public life? Well, I wrote an entire book about it, and you can get it on Amazon.com right now on your phone. And you can get 99 copies for your friends. But briefly, let me give one example. Let me give a very big summary statement. That we need to allow Christianity to shape not only our words, but our deeds. Not only our beliefs, and public policy beliefs, but our public disposition and demeanor. In other words, we need to combine truth and grace. What do I mean by truth? The truth content of what we believe and how we would apply it to policy, how we would apply it to who we vote for. But grace, by grace I mean a disposition of dependence upon God and thankfulness to Him for what He's done for us, so that we treat all the people around us with dignity, that when we interact we don't demean and degrade, ridicule, we don't tell partial truths and lies about the people we debate with. We don't treat them as morally reprehensible people in whom nothing good could be found, even if they're on the other side of the political aisle, especially if they're on the other side of the political aisle. Truth without grace makes us political bullies and jerks. Grace without truth makes us political wimps and non-entities. And each of us are probably going to tend in one direction or the other. But what we want to do is we want to exhibit that combination that Jesus exhibited, which is truth and grace together, and that is real strength. Real strength is the ability to do both of those at the same time and not merely one of them. So you're thinking, all right, Ashford, give us an example. I thought you'd never ask. So that brings us to our second segment of our talk. Give us an example. Let me take one Christian teaching, which is going to be teaching on human dignity, and I want to apply it to three public policy debates or disputes. And, we as Christians want to contribute to the common good, don't we? I think most people who profess Christ with any kind of sincerity really do want what's better for the entirety of our nation, not merely for our own tribe. We want to do good, but it's hard to know how to do good and how to show people our goodwill. So I'm going to show you how human dignity can help us, our belief in human dignity can help us do this. But just very briefly, before we do that, talking about morals in our age is pretty difficult, and here's why. Because on the one hand, we talk a big game morally. Justice for all, equality for all, want to get rid of poverty. We really have some really big things we want to do. And virtually no other society in human history has wanted to do these big things. But on the other hand, for the past 50 to 60 years, we've been tearing down the notion of truth and falsity and goodness and evil. So that most Americans right now believe that morality is either determined by Darwin's belief process. It's in development, it's in evolutionary development, or on the other hand, they believe that morality is socially constructed. And if either of those is the case, morality is not transcendent. There are no transcendent principles outside of us. And so truth becomes subjective. It becomes what we feel. And once truth is subjective, disagreement feels like hatred. And that's why we have a situation now where when we put forth our sincerely held beliefs in the public square, about half of the country thinks that we hate them. But we don't hate them. Disagreement is not hatred. So we're going to have to work overtime to show that we're not haters and that we're not bigots. Is it fair that we live in an age where we're viewed as haters and bigots? No, it's not. Is it a good response to that to become hateful and bigoted and to let our sense of injustice about that warp our dispositions so that we behave and act in ways that are ungodly? No, the answer is no, we can't do that. So let's talk about human dignity for a moment. One thing that human dignity teaches us is that unborn lives matter. Now, I want to address this, I hope, in a way that's a little bit different from any way you've heard it addressed before. I want to first draw upon three biblical teachings that tell us that unborn lives matter. Then I want to draw upon legal, medical, and sociological rationales to make the same argument, to show you how we can use a combination of these sorts of things to try to persuade, all right? Because public policy debates should be less like martial arts and more like a conversation with a neighbor over a cup of coffee. And I know if you ever look at your Facebook wall and you still have friends from high school and college, it doesn't look like that, does it? It's just the circumambient imbecility of our age is unbelievable, just all-encompassing idiocy of the whole moment right now, and we need to do a lot better. So let's talk about biblical passages for a moment. The Bible teaches us in Genesis chapter 1 that we are created in the image and likeness of God. This is a striking teaching in the Bible that was shocking. It doesn't shock us anymore, we've heard it so many times. But our great dignity is that God made us like Him so that we can commune with Him and know Him. That's our great dignity. Great humility is that we're not God, and we ought to remember that, okay? But He created everybody in His image and likeness, including unborn beings. Number 2, we can draw upon teachings like Exodus 20 and the 10 Commandments that teach us that it is not right ever to take innocent life, to shed innocent blood. And there's no more innocent blood that could be shed than a baby in a womb. And in a moment, I'm going to say this. Listen, in a room like this, there are probably a number of you in here who either yourself or a close family member has had an abortion or pressured an abortion or been in a doctor who's caused one. In a moment, I'm going to come back and say there is grace at the foot of the cross. There's not condemnation and judgment coming from me or from other believers on this issue, but there is deep conviction on this issue. And then finally, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him will not perish but have everlasting life. And that if God was willing, the cosmic king of the universe was willing to serve as a homeless itinerant teacher, be stripped naked, beaten and bloodied and crucified to save us from our sin. And if He gives us that kind of dignity, we ought to ascribe that kind of dignity to the people around us. There's some biblical reasons. Are there other reasons to believe that abortion is harmful? Yes, let me focus on Roe v. Wade, which I think was something like an environmental disaster on the moral ecology of our country. I was a candidate for abortion. I was born in 1974. My parents were almost, they were at the borderline of divorcing. And they could have very easily chosen to view me as the products of conception and to terminate me, and they didn't. So the first thing I want to say is this, reflecting on this as a former fetus, speaking to you as a former embryo, is that abortion is lethal violence against a baby. Medical technology has advanced so that we can see the horrible pain that a baby's in. And I'm not going to describe it, but when an abortion happens. I want you to consider this for a moment and reflect on it. That an unborn baby in the United States of America enjoys far less legal protection than an endangered species of bird in a forest outside of our house. And that's got to change. Abortion is also very bad for women. It's bad for women because it creates an environment that encourages men to do what they're already prone to do, which is to be sexual predators and morally and sexually irresponsible people. Because we've not only severed sex from marriage, we've also severed childbearing from sex. And so it just encourages men to prey on women. And if you think there's not a connection between a Harvey Weinstein culture and Roe v. Wade, then you need to do some reflection, because there's a strong connection. Abortion is bad for men. It marginalizes men. It strips them of responsibility for the greatest thing they could do on earth, which is to be a husband and a father. A man has zero input in whether or not the child that he helped to create is killed. Abortion is bad for families. It teaches a family that if you have a problem bad enough, you can solve it with lethal violence. Abortion is bad for law-governed democracy. Because and the greatest irony in American history, just after the 1960s, when it looked like our nation had turned a corner on serious forms of racism, that maybe we could really and truly say justice and equality for all. Just a few years after that, 5 black gown Ivy League lawyers on the Supreme Court determined that there would not be justice and equality for all, that in fact there was an entire class of human beings, not blacks, but unborns, that would not receive justice or equality. Roe v. Wade was bad for checks and balances because it was 5 gowned lawyers taking upon themselves what the legislator should have done. In other words, bypassing we the people. And then finally, abortion was bad for society at large in that it eroded our moral foundations. Mary Ann Glendon, professor at Harvard Law School, is the one who said that Roe v. Wade was something like an environmental disaster in the moral ecology of our country. It numbed our collective consciences. It eroded our moral foundations. It blunted our most basic moral intuitions that we're to protect the weakest, most vulnerable among us. I mean, when you hold a baby for the first time, I remember holding my oldest daughter for the first time. I was scared. I sat in the chair beside the hospital bed before I held the baby. I didn't want to stand up for fear that I would drop my baby. Now, babies are more resilient than I knew at the time. But we know intuitionally to treasure the weakest and most vulnerable. But Roe v. Wade taught us that we don't have to. And so we use linguistic gymnastics to hide what we really know is going on. Instead of referring to a baby as a baby, we refer to him or her as products of conception, masking from other people and even from ourselves, trying to evade what it is that we've really done as a society. But also, human dignity teaches us that Black lives matter. Now, I've been a conservative in America for 44 years. I'm farther to the right than Sam Donaldson's part. Those of you of a certain age will remember Sam Donaldson. I'm farther to the right than a tricycle in the Audubon. Anyway, so I can't affirm the rather left-leaning socialist agenda of the BLM movement, but what I can affirm and what we ought to affirm and what ought to come out of our lips regularly is that Black lives matter. What we see on the media outlets is not what most Black people think. When they say Black lives matter, what they're saying is, would you just affirm to me that you do view me on the same level as your white brothers and sisters? And conservatives, we haven't done well with that. We haven't done as well as we could. We need to lead with that kind of comment. We don't need to let, I'm just speaking to conservatives. I mean, we probably have people on every side of the spectrum here. But let me speak as a conservative to conservatives. We need to lead out with that. We need to be at the front of the parade, affirming the God-given dignity of our Black brothers and sisters. I've got Black colleagues and friends whose wives don't want them to go out at night to Walmart after dark. You may think that's founded or unfounded, but it's a real feeling. And we need to find ways of reaching out and loving our Black brothers and sisters and affirming that. The original environmental disaster in the moral ecology of our country was the institution of slavery. And it's a cleanup that we still haven't cleaned it up. And we need to finish the cleanup process. Maybe I could just make another comment on this quickly. Racism, any sin in the Bible comes in 2 forms. Personal, it's committed by individuals, but when enough individuals in a society commit that sin, it coalesces to warp society's institutions. So with racism, like with any other sin, it is likely that our institutions have been warped. We need to be willing to admit that. We don't need to go overboard with it. We need to process it correctly, but I think as conservatives, it would behoove us and do us really well to admit it where we find it and to work against it where we find it. And then finally, I want to say that undocumented lives matter. So I write on immigration. I'm a secure the borders guy. You want to see my articles? Go to Daily Caller. I write for them. I also think that as we secure the borders, which every nation has a right and usually a responsibility to do, that the language we use in explaining why we're securing the borders and the way we treat people at the borders needs to be deeply and genuinely Christian. We can do justice and mercy at the same time. I'm speaking as a conservative to conservatives. If you're on the left, I would have a different set of issues I would talk with you about. So all lives matter, every single one of them, including the ones that are not born. So there's a Christian teaching, human dignity. Now the third thing is this. All right, Ashford, so you've told us how Christianity and politics fit together. You've given us an example of how one biblical doctrine can shape our view on 3 different policy issues. Now, how do we do this thing in a secular age, right? So, I think a lot of times when we watch TV, and maybe we should stop watching as much as we do, because the media outlets, I'm telling you, the media outlets are making money. And they make money off of anger and fear. And so everything gets exaggerated, and it looks like the entire country's burning down. And if we keep watching the news, it might actually burn down. We might all be convinced that everyone else in the country is a bunch of idiots and jerks. But all that to say, when we watch the news, I despair. I've been so disillusioned the past 2 or 3 years, or the past 10, 15, because the forces arrayed against us seem so powerful, right? But you need to know and you need to remember that God and His Word and that God and His gospel are even more powerful than any force that can be arrayed among us. 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." And in fact, if you don't hear anything else tonight, I want you to hear this. John 20:21, Jesus looked at His disciples and He said, "As the Father sent me, so I send you." And when He told them that, He showed them the holes in His hands and His side. And one of the points that He was making is this, that if I, as the cosmic King of the universe, came to speak truth to power and declare that Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not, that if I did that and I was crucified, then when you do that, you're going to suffer too. And so listen, if the cosmic King of the universe, the only innocent one among us, could suffer a death on a cross, then we in this room in North Carolina can suffer a little bit of social ostracism. Some people who are angry on our Facebook wall and type in all caps with exclamation marks. I want to steal the all caps keys and exclamation marks from these people and see if they could even say anything at all. So Jesus, when Jesus came, He was prophetic. He spoke the truth to power, and we can do the same thing. He was sacrificial. He was a homeless itinerant teacher who had nowhere to lay his head. And so we can be willing to suffer some setbacks socially and have some neighbors who don't like us or think we're weird or backwards. We might suffer some setbacks as businessmen when people know what we believe, right? The corporate world is arrayed against us in many ways. The big corporations are, many of them. Jesus was humbly confident too, because He knew He'd return one day to set the world to rights. So let me give you 4 tips, 4 things, they're not the only 4, but 4 things that I think we need to do as we're increasingly marginalized in our country, all right? Maybe the marginalization will stop. I certainly hope so. That's what I'm working for. I don't want to lose. All I'm saying is we can't control whether our view of the good life and our view politically is going to win the day. So if we as Christians continue to get marginalized, here's 4 things we're going to continue to need to do. The first is we're going to need to reintroduce God, recenter Him in public life. Most people have some sort of a view of our God that we believe in, and they're wildly wrong about Him. And we've got to find a way of reintroducing Him. Hi, I'd like for you to meet the King of the universe. You've never really met Him. You think you have, but you haven't. What are some ways of doing that? I'm going to have to go very quickly here. But if what I say, if you don't catch it all, and I'm going to have to go very quickly, but if it resonates with you, buy the book. We're going to need to learn to realize that the Bible's narrative of the world is the true story of the world, and that MSNBC's narrative, and CNN's narrative, and Fox's narrative are not the true story of the whole world. They're a smaller narrative of the world. They each pick out their own evils in the world, and then their own saviors from those evils. But only the Bible is the true story of the whole world. And we need to let the Bible frame the way we view things and the way we treat people. No matter what the radio talk show hosts say, no matter what the political pundits say, no matter what many of our political leaders do, we will cut our own wake. We're Christians first and foremost. That's our first team. Republicans or Democrats, second team. That means that we're never intensely or entirely loyal to any political leader, any political party. That is what John means when he says we're bipartisan. We actually, the only person we give full allegiance to is Christ the King, who will return one day to install a one-world government and a one-party system where justice will roll down like the waters. And he's gonna make things right, okay? And that's our great hope, our certain hope. So we want to reintroduce God by letting people see that the Bible's narrative of the world is a true narrative. Also by showing people that false gods don't deliver. The false gods of sexual freedom, wealth acquisition, power accumulation, material equality, cultural heritage. I mean, you name it. Anything you elevate above God. Anytime you take something that God created or gave us and elevate it above Him and worship Him, it's going to go badly for you. And if we can show that and connect the dots for people, then we can introduce to them the real and true God and how His vision for human life and flourishing is the only real and true vision. So we've got to recenter God, put Him back at the center, and at the same time we have to decenter the self. Two people can't share the stage in this sort of a situation. So how do we decenter the self? Jeremiah 29:7, God tells Israel to seek the welfare of the city, to put down roots, plant vineyards, have farms, have children. This is when they were in exile. What God was saying is, I want you, my people, to put down roots in this city and make it a better place. What we can do as Christians is to make very clear to the people around us that we want what is best for the entirety of the nation. We're not just special pleading for ourselves and our own tribe. This is not identity politics. We're seeking the good for every identity and not merely our own identity. A second thing that we can do, and this one's really important, and this is the one that's caused me, I don't know, it just has felt like the past few years have been a gut punch. We are going to have to learn how to stand there in the moment when people are arrayed against us, telling partial truths about us, lies about us, misunderstanding our motivations, thinking we're hateful people, cursing at us, mocking us. And we're going to have to learn to stand there in the moment and not respond in kind. It's deeply important that we don't respond in kind. We should not take the cues of political leaders who do that. We're going to be very careful not to do that. It's the quickest way to lose our moral authority, to lose our witness. It takes a lot. It takes strength. It's a weak person who has to insult and mock and karate chop and fight. That's weakness. That's not strength. Strength is to stand there in the moment and be a statesman like John Rustin, like Dan Forrest, like any number of other people. And there's people on both sides of the aisle who carry themselves with dignity and strength. To stand there in a civil manner and put forth reasoned discourse and to care about the person you're talking to, that is strength. And we, as of all people as Christians, should engage in public life in that manner. Strength, not weakness. Number 3, we need to reframe the issues. A lot of times when there's contentious issues in American life, it's because you have two secular parties who have framed those issues in their own terms. So even if I almost always agree with one party instead of the other, the way I reach my conclusions is different, or my tone is different, or maybe my conclusion is a little bit different. And I think it's very important for us to do that, to let our Christianity be the master shaper. Now listen to this. Too many of us have sat in our homes for hours every night, for thousands of hours over the course of our life, and we have been discipled by our favorite political talk show hosts. So that our view of the world is shaped almost entirely by the talk show host rather than by the Scriptures. And we have absolutely got to fight to reverse that. And then finally, we need to revitalize cultural institutions. I don't have time to go through that because I don't want to skip the conclusion, all right? But we need to work to shape cultural institutions, our schools, our legal institutions, our families, our churches, to make those institutions as strong as they can be. And that is why local politics and state politics in its own way is much more important than national politics. That's where school systems get shaped. Families get shaped, churches get shaped, businesses are shaped. So the relationship between Christianity, politics, and public life is not an insignificant matter, as I conclude. Our secular age is in many ways a very challenging one for us as Christians, right? It's a pretty challenging age. And listen to this. Our society will lose much of what is good about it if it loses the Christian influence. And we can be salt and light no matter how tough it gets, no matter how many of the forces are arrayed against us. That Christianity is custom built to give witness from the margins. Doesn't matter how powerful those forces are, God and His Word are more powerful. God and His gospel is more powerful. One day when I die, or when the Lord returns, I'm going to meet him as an American. Now, that's not my primary identity. My primary identity is Christian. But I'm an American. And I'll also meet him as an American. And I'll give count to him for what I did with the nation that he put in our hands. And so I want to just ask you tonight to think about what are some ways that you, with the life that God has given you, can be a faithful steward to the citizenship with which he's entrusted you. Citizen of the great state of North Carolina. There's no state I'd rather live in. It actually turns out to be probably the most important state in national politics right now. So what can we do at the local level, at the state level, and maybe even at the national level? Think about it. What can you do? One thing you can do is support this institution. They didn't ask me to say that, and I mean it. One day, Christ will return. It's the last thing I'm going to say. And he will institute, like I said, a one-world government and a one-party system, and justice will roll down like the waters. But until that day, maybe God in his grace will allow us in this room to be the heart and strength of the state of North Carolina and maybe of our nation, and to be at the forefront of any good movement of social, cultural, and political concern. I'm going to close in prayer and ask the Lord to work in and through a policy banquet to do big things in our lives in the future. Let's pray together. Father, we come to you in the name of your Son and by the power of your Spirit. Because of your Son, we come boldly before your throne with confidence. We ascribe all glory and power and honor to you and to you alone. We thank you for your goodness to us, that you sent your Son to save us, that you've revealed your word to us. We thank you that you have planted us in the great state of North Carolina, and that you've put us in the 21st century in the midst of this secular context. And we pray, Father, that you will help us to exhibit that combination that your Son exhibited, that combination of truth and grace, as we seek to be at the heart of every good movement of social, cultural, and political concern. For your glory, Lord. And in the name of your Son we pray. Amen.